All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another agronomy update. I'm Rachel Willis, technical agronomist in Northern Illinois, and I'm joined by Jim Donnelly, another technical agronomist in Northern Illinois. We have a couple agronomy updates for you to talk about this morning. So, big thing we're going to talk about is kind of the crop progress, what we're seeing. We'll start out with GDUs, though. We always talk about GDUs, where we're at. Move into crop progress, stalks, roots, what this latest weather is doing to the crop, and then maybe wrap up with some harvest considerations in there when we talk about the overall crop progress.
All right, so I'll kind of touch on the GDUs. So Rachel's put a couple of these slides together, and essentially just looking at different locations and our GDU accumulations starting May 1st. So in these slides, again, we're assuming a planting date of May 1st, which we tried to be consistent, over the year. All of our GDU slides have been from May 1st. And so looking at Aledo, this is assuming a 114-day maturing hybrid. We're looking at a predicted black layer date of September 15th. So coming up in a couple weeks, one thing that I would say is that compared to normal, is you can see that purple line there, the 30-year average. We are ahead of schedule. And so it's not as big of a surprise to me considering, some of those warm nights that we had throughout the year. And that's where you get your GDU accumulation mostly for the summertime is those warmer nighttime temperatures. That's how we tend to get more GDU accumulation faster. So again, Aledo, Illinois, we're looking at September 15th. For Princeton, about September 18th. And again, above average compared to normal, but also right on track with where we were, in 2025 last year. Go ahead to DEKALB, same thing, just a little bit later. So September 25th for a 114-day hybrid, again ahead of schedule, but on par with 2025 last year. So that is one thing that we wanted to communicate is that we are going to be similar in terms of maturity, at least the way we sit right now compared to last year. Now, that can change, based on forecasted temperatures. I will say the next week actually looks pretty warm. So we're probably going to be accumulating GDUs a little bit faster than normal for the week. So it could accelerate even quicker than that. But just realize that we're pretty much on track to being, ahead of schedule and may, even more so be ahead of schedule. So next slide, I did want to add, so we always have areas and for me, that Rock Falls area is always a little bit ahead of schedule, partly because, we have lighter soils and those tend to get planted earlier. And in addition, some of those lighter soils tend to get stress and they tend to accelerate in maturity as a result. So one thing I wanted to comment is some of the earlier planted stuff around this area always tends to mature a little bit earlier. And here, if you figure a April 20th planting date, we are looking at a black layer of approximately August 29th for a earlier maturing 103-day hybrid. If you bump it up to 106, 107, you're looking at probably the very beginning of September. And so while we've got a lot of corn that's really starting to turn in that area, it is kind of on time. So we're going to talk a little bit about some crown rot and stuff that we're seeing a little bit later. So some of that is affecting that a little bit too, causing it to go a little bit earlier. But it is certainly closer to where it should be, than maybe we think.
Yeah, so I pulled these slides using a 114 because I know a lot of people use 114s, but that's probably not their very first corn. So, everybody probably has something a little bit earlier than that as well that's even closer to black layer. And again, to Jim's point, we had a lot of people planting the end of April as well.
Mhm.
So if you're starting to see corn drying down, it could just be that it's, your regular plain old dry down and getting close to black layer rather than crown rot potentially. So even though we have these slides, we're showing middle of September, we probably have corn that's going to black layer before the middle of September.
Yep. So I did want to add in some dry down slides, and I kind of like to show this just to try and anticipate what kind of dry down speeds that we will have. On the left is kind of a normal dry down rate. So historically looking at, starting grain moisture and then, so many days after black layer, what's that typical dry down rate? So normally the first 20 days after black layer, you tend to lose 0.7% per day. And then following that, it tends to go down, and it's just natural. It's just a result of historical temperatures. As temperatures cool off, dry down tends to go down. So that's just kind of looking at historical average. That's from Iowa State. To the right is Purdue, and this is the one that I like to show because it's just looking at temperature. And as you guys know, again, the higher the temperature, the faster you tend to lose moisture, especially if you add wind to it. Just like turning on the fan in a bin, it tends to help that as well. And essentially, what this is showing is that for every degree increase, you tend to lose 0.02% per day. And it doesn't sound like a lot, but when you start changing, 20 degrees per day, it does make a difference. And what this is showing is that if we end up having a mean temperature of 73 during the day, which is a typical low of 60, high of 85, something like that, you can end up losing 0.8% per day at those temperatures. And when we look at the forecast that we're looking at for that very end of August, first part of September, we're looking at highs in the 90s. So we could easily exceed that and get to 1 percentage point per day or more, depending on how hot it gets. So the message here is that if we have these areas, like I mentioned in Rock Falls, that were earlier planted or reaching black layer, we get some of this heat, like it's going to go quite a bit faster than maybe guys think. So everybody should be ready, to go tackle that. And honestly, be thankful we have the heat to get some free dry down. To be honest with you. So the other thing is, again, Rachel's going to talk a little bit about crown rot and some, eroding stalk health situations in places. It's another reason we want to make sure that we're kind of going after that, and let's not get fooled, without checking it, because it could be a lot drier than what we think.
Yeah, I think this really rapid dry down um, is realistic. That's what's happened the last couple of years in my geography. We go out there, and I feel like I get more complaints about really dry corn than I do about wet corn because we set ourselves up with really good dry down conditions early with really warm temperatures. September is often pretty nice and warm.
Yeah.
And so that's very realistic. When I look at this chart, it seems like it's what's happened the last couple of years.
Yeah, and let's not forget about phantom yield loss. As you get essentially below 21, 22, you do start to see increase in phantom yield loss. And then the other thing is, I know that especially with economics, it's tempting to let the corn dry in the field. One, remember you can't get it once it's on the ground, and then two, it's very cheap to dry corn when the outside air temperatures are 80 degrees. So just keep all those things in mind when you're weighing when to start harvest and when not to.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk really quick here. This slide is not pretty. I'm not great at making pretty slides, and you guys know I really like numbers and data and stuff. So you shouldn't be surprised that I'm going to give you a slide full of ugly numbers. But what I want to talk about here is, it goes along a little bit with the weather there and grain fill, I guess. In general, when I've been out looking, our overall kernel count is down a little bit. We've noticed it, others have noticed it. If you're doing any sort of yield checks or crop tours, you probably counted and found kernel counts down just a little bit in spots. I will say it varies a little bit. I can be in one part of my territory and see some 14 by 30s, and I can go to another part of my territory and see more like 16 by 32 or 35. So it does vary a little bit, but the point of this is that if we go out and we go strictly on kernel count, we could be a little bit disappointed, especially if we're using. We should never be using 90, but I know that some folks are using 90, especially if we're using 90. But even if we're using 80, I think we're going to be a little disappointed. And what I have here is just a quick chart on rows by length. I use the same population. I know population is a big driving factor. I could only put so many factors in here before it became really, really messy. So use the same population. I think that we do have a lot of 34, 35 population out there, but I changed the factor, the dividing factor here. So this first one, if you do a 14 by 30 and you use a factor of 80, which I don't think is realistic, you have a yield of 184. If you use a factor of 60, you're up to 245 in that same. So the only thing that has changed there is that dividing factor. And what that goes back to is grain fill. We've had pretty decent grain fill conditions. We have plenty of moisture. I don't think that we're incredibly stressed. We've had some nice sunlight. We're going to have some more nice sunlight here next week. So I think we have good grain fill conditions, especially on a 14 by 30. We're going to get really good grain fill, I think. And so I wanted to just kind of point out that using a different factor can make a huge difference. So on this top one, it's like a 60 bushel difference there when you look at a factor of 80 versus 60. I changed the row length, or I changed the length here, and I did 35. So I have a 14 by 35. And using different factors there, you have an even bigger swing as far as yield. So I don't want us to go out and just count kernels and be really disappointed. We need to make sure that we're thinking through the grain fill conditions. Jim and I were talking about this earlier. There's not very many scenarios where 80 is the right factor, and there's even fewer scenarios in Illinois where 90 is the right factor. Most years it's something under that, and on a ear that's only 14 around, it can really, really fill. So you can get really good kernel depth there. So I wanted to point that out. Think through, kernel depth and grain fill conditions before you go out and just be really disappointed in those kernel counts.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything to add on that, Jim?
Yeah, there's a few things I was going to cover, and I'm not going to remember them all.
That happens to me too.
So, I would start with, you made the comment about 90, and like some of the tours using 90, and like, kind of like we talked about, like it depends on what your purpose of the end goal of what you're doing, So, it's probably important for them to use 90 and the same factor year over year to provide consistency from one year to the next. Like that's where I can see the importance of that. If you are wanting to try and best guess what the yield of your field is, then 90 is rarely a number that you would ever use. Like if you're using 90, you're probably going to be getting an insurance check anyway, so it probably doesn't matter. But realistically, my numbers historically like essentially start at 80, maybe 85, but usually it's 80, and then go down from there based on conditions, based on row number, things like that. So, when we have times where we're blessed with, cooler grain fill periods with ample sunshine, like 70 is not out of the question at all. in a normal situation. Now, if you have a hybrid that's throwing 20 around, that number is going to be higher versus a hybrid that is, throwing 14s, then you're going to divide by a lower number. And 60 is not unrealistic at all either. So, some of this depends on hybrid characteristics as well. So I want to make sure that, you guys know that a hybrid that throws 14 to 16 around rarely will do, 20 to 22. You know, that's just a lot of that is driven by genetics, but then the environment will tweak where it ends up being in that range. To Rachel's point, though, like we've been kind of noticing rows around, that number has been lower just throughout the countryside. But I would anticipate that those kernels will be bigger as a result, so we'll be dividing by a smaller number. So yeah, I'm not necessarily freaking out, at least in our area, in terms of that. In terms of numbers, I think things are going to be pretty good. But just make sure that when you're doing the numbers, make sure you're dividing by what you should be. So. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit just about historical weather patterns. And, I think these next few slides just kind of show how how much of a roller coaster year that it's been. I think starting off with this month of May, and so this is looking at, their precipitation rank historically over the last 134 years by climate district. So, for the northwest part of, our geography, we're looking at one of the driest years or Mays on record. And so when we think about implications of that, one thing I think about is the entire lack of tar spot that we have had for, the bulk of the growing season. And, to me, this is a big factor right here, is having hardly any moisture in the month of May for tar spot to get going, and other diseases, for that matter as well. So, I think this is a giant factor on why some of our leaf health has been pretty decent this year, as we got a really slow start on foliar diseases. So then we move to June, and it does get a lot wetter. As you can see, Central Illinois started to get very wet, and ranked 10th out of 134 years. Northwest Illinois 5, and Northeast Illinois, like, that's nothing to shake a stick at. That's pretty darn damp historically over the last 134 years. So we did a big swing. We kind of thought that we would start to see more fungal diseases as a result of this, but it is possible that the dryness beforehand just really slowed things down. Next slide. So again, we kind of had another swing. So Central Illinois, Northwest Illinois, it started to get really dry again. So bottom half of, the historical years as far as ranks and precipitation. So another dry down, again, probably slowed things down, additionally provided some additional stress. So I want you guys to remember that, the slide beforehand, we had very wet conditions, probably denitrification, things like that. And then you add dry spells on top of it, just probably additional stress that may trigger things that Rachel may talk about here in a bit. And then finally, I think, we all remember basically this month and how wet it's been. That's kind of been the talk amongst the tours, especially Pro Farmer, looking at all of these climate districts with the #1 rank in precipitation. Extremely wet, again, losing more nitrogen at a invaluable time, and also, potentially providing, more risk in terms of developing crown rots and things like that. So just an overall, topsy-turvy roller coaster type year in terms of precipitation and heat is probably going to to cause some abnormal things that we're going to have to deal with. Next slide.
Yep. So Jim did a good job of setting up that we had kind of a up and down year, and we had some stress there. And we've already talked about, we're seeing a little bit of crown rot showing up already. And I think that some of that can be explained by, a lot of that can be explained by the weather that we've had. So when we planted, if you guys remember, it was pretty cold when we planted. I wore a hoodie for it felt like all of May and part of June. So we had pretty cool conditions there after planting. In some cases, our corn was a little bit slow to come up because it was fit, but it was cool out, and it was a little bit slow, set in the ground for just a little bit longer. And those conditions at planting can kind of give us the potential for crown rot. So with crown rot, you need that early season stress, but then you also need stress during grain fill or after pollination. And Jim did a nice job of kind of showing some of those stresses. And so as we get closer to harvest, you're going to probably see more and more of these ghosts here. And so what I call a ghost is a plant that clearly died early. It's not that kind of beautiful golden color that you see at the end of the year. It's like it kind of like freeze dried, and it's kind of a weird grayish, greenish color. And you can see the differences here in the healthy plant versus the ghosted plant next to it. And that's a sign of early death. And most of the time in my geography, when I see that, it's related to crown rot. So again, crown rot, cool at planting, followed by that stress during pollination, or after pollination, not during pollination, after pollination and during grain fill. We usually see this around R5. So when you're at that 50% milk line, and that's about when we start to see it. So we talked a little bit earlier, we're going to have corn that is going to be, close to that here in the next few weeks. We're starting to see it. We'll see a little bit more in that right growth stage for crown rot to show up. And so don't be surprised if you see a little bit of that out there. You'll also just be seeing things normally, drying down and black layering like normal. I have a slide here that I've used a couple times in the past. So this first slide on the left there is a pretty early corn plant. You can find crown rot early, and I know that some of you probably have been out looking for it because we all kind of thought this spring had potential to give us crown rot. So you can see it early where that crown is really, really dark. That crown sometimes will be slightly darker in general because all of those nodes are stacked up really tight there, but it shouldn't be brown like it is here in this picture. So you can see crown rot really early. This other one is crown rot just a little bit later, the one on the right, and you still see where the part of the pith is still healthy, but you have that crown that's really dying down, and you can see kind of extra moisture retention even up into the pith of that one on the right, where we probably have some restrictions of movement there. So I don't want you to go out and start splitting all of your crowns at this point in the season. You will probably start to see the ghosts earlier on in the season. You can go through and split and see these crowns. If you're not sure if what you're seeing is crown rot, splitting the crown is a good way to see it. If you have a completely dead plant out there, everything is going to look rotten, and it's going to be kind of hard to tell what it is. But my other favorite way to look for crown rot, like to go out and kick plants just right at the crown. Put your steel toes on so you don't hurt your toes. Go out there and kick the plants, and it will kind of break apart right there at the base of the base of plant, of the crown there, if you have crown rot. From a management standpoint, there's not a lot that we can do right now to manage crown rot. The biggest thing is if you find fields with crown rot in them, you need to prioritize those for harvest. They probably will dry down faster than normal because they have died early. But because of that, you'll lose stock integrity a lot faster. So if you're seeing crown rot out there, really, really prioritize those fields for an earlier harvest. Anything you want to add on crown rot, Jim?
No, not really, Rachel. I think you kind of hit all the nails on the head there.
Okay. So the other thing that I'm seeing from a stock standpoint is a little bit of Physoderma node breakage. This slide kind of talks about the difference between Physoderma node breakage and other stock rots. I have heard of a few folks talking about anthracnose stock rot already. There's a little bit of top dieback out there. These photos, one of them was taken, the one where the stalk is kind of kinked over and you can see that black on the outside. That was taken later on in harvest last year. The other one with the just horrendously bad anthracnose stalk rot in the middle of that pith where the pith is rotted, that's actually from an inoculated trial. So that's kind of showing the worst of the worst on stalk rots. But the point that I wanted to make using that example is that Physoderma node breakage is a little bit different. Usually when you have Physoderma node breakage, it breaks, like it's a clean break, and it breaks right there at the node. And you can see that in that right hand picture there, where you have just a completely green stalk. It broke right at the node, and that pith is still really nice and green and healthy. Physoderma kind of rots from the outside in there, and it weakens that node. Whereas you have stalk rots are going to kind of rot from the inside out, and you'll have weakened nodes, but a lot of times you see it kind of like kink over, not completely break clean. If you're seeing either of these, again, the biggest thing that you can do is prioritize those fields for harvest. I've seen a little bit of Physoderma node breakage. It's kind of sporadic is how I would describe it. I haven't seen it widespread in fields. I think further south and further east, they've been talking a little bit about it. They're finding it as well. When we see Physoderma, it's a sign of a wet year. And as Jim said, we did have a wet year part of the time. We also had a dry year part of the time. So we have the conditions for some Physoderma there. If you're seeing an excessive amount of Physoderma, you're seeing a lot of stalk rots out there. Again, just prioritize those fields so that you can get them harvested before they go down.
Yeah, to Rachel's point, I mean, this is a wet year disease. And, just remember that, although the inoculum requires lots of free moisture, so filling up the whorls with water, either from rain or really heavy dews, really in that V5 to V9 time frame is really the most impactful. It's why, we kind of see it, but it's heavier further south and southeast where they've had the heavier rains, day in and day out, it seems like.
Yeah. Yeah. And I kind of forgot that I had this slide as I was talking nonstop about Physoderma. Basically, it's saying the same thing that I had said earlier. One thing to, if you look at management advice for Physoderma, it will say you can work on drainage because having heavy saturated soils with plenty of moisture can potentially make it worse. That's a kind of a hard thing to work on. And if you get excessive rainfall, it doesn't actually make that big of a difference. So the biggest thing, if you have really bad Physoderma, rotation is probably the best thing. Most of our hybrids now are better on Physoderma than they were, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. So, if you notice that one hybrid consistently has it worse, let Jim and I know. But overall, I think that we are less susceptible than we used to be. So again, the biggest thing is harvest those fields first and then consider crop rotation. All right, so, in summary, Jim did a nice job talking about black layer dates. I think we're going to be very similar to last year. So we talked about mid-September black layer for May planted 114-day hybrids. But think back to last year, we were, in some cases, we were harvesting before mid-September, depending on the geography. And I think we'll be there this year as well. So we're very similar to last year on black layer. We've had some cycles of wet and dry this year, so it is a little bit of a different year compared to last year, with maybe slightly different problems and also not the same problems that we had last year. We're seeing some stalks show up, or some rots show up. We have some stalk rots, we have some crown rots. The biggest thing that you can do right now is be out scouting, know what you have out there in the field so that you can prioritize those fields for harvest, but then also be scouting so that we're not waiting too long to get started on harvest. Jim did a good job of summarizing the GDUs and talking about dry down. I feel like most years we have really, really dry corn at the end, and we would like to prevent really losing a lot of yield from that phantom yield loss by getting started as soon as we can. Anything to add there, Jim?
I think you nail it, Rachel.
All right. Well, we appreciate you guys listening in. And as always, give us a call if you have questions.